welcome to the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize Awards. I know that many of you are looking up here and you're thinking to yourselves, oh, lovely. Nick Clooney could not make it here tonight, but he sent his handsome son George to stand in for him. A smaller laugh would have been okay on that one, too. I'm actually honored to be here. I've been coming here for so many years. I was trying to get nostalgic about it earlier today. The first year I came here, there was no internet back then. It's true. The books that we were awarding were all hand-lettered by monks. The Wright brothers were just a bunch of crazy teenagers down the road. But it's so great to be here and to be back and to see so many wonderful faces who have known for over the years. You guys are in for a really special night. We are going to be awarding 4 spectacular and really special books this evening, as well as all the Richard Holbrook Lifetime Achievement Award will be presented this evening as well. But before we get to that, I want to introduce you to the founder and the co-chair of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, which is now celebrating its 12th year. Without her, none of this evening would be possible. I am honored to introduce to you Sharon Robb.
Oh, hello, and thank you for coming. And thank you, Gilbert. It is so wonderful to have Gilbert come back, and we tease him about perfect attendance, but we hope you have perfect attendance forever. It's a wonderful thing to have him here. And I'd like to say welcome to all of you on behalf of Mark Meister, my co-chair, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation Board, and the Advisory Board, and the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people who make this happen. And all you have to do is look through that program and you're going to see how many people it takes to work all year to make this happen. The DLPP is made up of a community of readers and writers working for peace, and that includes every single person on this stage. Without you, the awards would not be possible, and without your generosity, we could not have them. I want you to take a look at the 2 maps that we are continuing to spread the words of peace around the globe. This year we were able to add the Republic of Ireland and Ghana to the growing list of countries of origin of our writers, and to expand the settings for our books to include the Republic of Ireland, Ghana, Colombia, and Cuba. And Patricia took us to many of those places. I thought tonight, as I began to think about what I wanted to talk about, I thought, well, I want to talk about empathy, and I want to talk about truth. And so for a while, as I was letting those ideas come to fruition, I couldn't decide which I was going to talk about. But both of them are so missing right now in the daily news. 2 years ago, I was asked to speak on empathy as it relates to literature and peace to an honor seminar at Wright State University the seminar focused on empathy and literature. And after I got over my delight that they even had a course like that, I looked over the quotes of the DLPP authors, and I thought, I'm going to take a look to see what they have to say. And I was absolutely struck by the fact so many of them use the term empathy in the statements that they made about winning. The great majority of their comments talked about empathy as central to the quest for peace. Susan Southard said, "Can we as individuals and as a nation have the courage to acknowledge, understand, and empathize with people in our own country or abroad whom we have profoundly hurt?" James Hanahan showed us that the abuse of power destroys people at every level of the exchange. Gilbert did too. Up in the Jim Crow balconies, hundreds of Black Americans would travel miles to see Lawyer Marshall. This would be the first time they would see in court a Black man who was not the defendant, a Black man wearing a suit, looking prosecutors and judges in the eye, arguing the law. He was giving Black citizens a glimpse of what was possible in America. Anthony Doerr said, "Literature is uniquely qualified to develop our compassion, empathy, and attentiveness. A good piece of writing should be an antidote to hatred." One of our honorary advisory boards, Bob Shakocha, said, "Even in democracies, speaking truth to power is not a welcome act. Why are books subversive? Because they exchange ignorance for knowledge and empathy. Empathy is the breeding ground for justice, for mercy, for fairness, for templates of redemption, and for allowing the validity of a point of view other than your own." And Barbara Kingsolver knows the connection between literature and empathy. "We are not born with empathy. It develops like a muscle. Undoubtedly, it strengthens with use. And that's the basis for my belief that literature is a tool for creating peace. To coexist, we have to find and exercise our muscles of empathy. And we do this from our earliest days through story." The reflections on empathy and peace from this year's winners echo the previous winners as well. Patricia Engel says that an award should recognize the power of the written word to foster human understanding and eradicate imposed and imagined borders in the world community is remarkably brave and reminds us that as artists, we are called through our work, above all things, to the pursuit of peace. Jesse said, "Literature shows us the world as it truly is, but also shows us the world as it could be: peaceful, empathetic, humane." David Wood saw that words had power even in a war-torn state when he was documenting how the Dayton Literary Peace Agreement was gradually transforming a fragile ceasefire into a structure enabling Bosnians and Serbs and Croats to begin the hard work of recovering their common humanity. In Wales, Ben Rollins wrote, "Empathy is the beginning of peace between people. Stories that show us the world through eyes not our own are the way that we learn empathy. Through fiction," Colm says, "we learn to see others." Literature teaches empathy. That's a conclusion of a recent study published in the Journal of Science. It found that after reading literary fiction, people perform better on tests measuring empathy, social perception, and emotional intelligence. Teachers and parents, writers and readers have instinctively known that to be true for a long time, but now the studies confirm it. The empathy that comes from reading literature can make us more discerning readers, even as readers of news. A recent Facebook post by our dear friend Marlon James came to mind as I was writing this. Marlon wrote, "2 women survived for 5 months at sea, braving it against 2 shark attacks, taking care of their pets, and being generally badass and awesome." But the headline reads, "2 women rescued." Which they were. But peel that back a little, and Marlon wants you to consider the patriarchy embedded in that statement, to get to the truth of it. As his friends responded, the men wrote that had the 2 been men, they would have had the same headline. The women thanked Marlon and said, "Typical, and my heart is in my boots." We all know we have a long ways to go when it comes to gender empathy. As we search for truth at a time when talk is cheap and truth is elusive, I find myself turning to books for insight, wanting to find the people who know, the people who care enough to sit down and write for hours and research for days, years, decades, who take their time to find the right word, the perfect sentence, who revise and interview and think again. When Viet Thanh Nguyen was announced as being the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award, his friends on Facebook asked him what he did the day he found out, and Viet said, "I wrote 4 sentences." Some of his followers didn't realize the significance. 4 solid sentences, a good day's work. Andrew Kavak knows What remains is for us to keep telling of peace, as well as to keep praying for it, to keep insisting upon it, as well as to keep hoping for it, to keep listening so we'll know when to act, whether it's out in the world or at work on a sentence, alone in a room with words. To write a book, you have to come to some conclusion. You have to have moved through pages of notes, thousands of drafts and revisions, to finally arrive at a message that holds true. Colm commented, slowly then, a sentence or a set of sentences that have their own integrity, their own sense of balance, their own striving towards worth, can become a sonorous metaphor for much else, including for how we might live in the world, how we might see others, what we might do. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it has to be true. At the end of it, I began to realize that empathy and truth were not two separate topics after all. That empathy is the key to understanding the truth of the human condition. Colm explains the connection well. Good writing thus has elements and undercurrents that are moral as well as aesthetic. Good sentences offer us a way to imagine life in all its strangeness and ambiguity and possibility, alert us to the power of the imagination to transform and transcend our nature, offer us a blueprint not only for who we are, but for who we might be, who we might become. Advancing peace through literature is an important mission and a difficult one. It heartens me that we are not alone in this endeavor. One day last week, when I went to the P.O. box to gather all those little blue response envelopes, there was also a larger white envelope. It was about like this. Curious as to what it was, I stood by the car to open it. It had a Swedish stamp, and it had a return address in Stockholm. I gasped when I opened it. Michael Nobel, the great-grandnephew of Alfred Nobel, nominated a writer for our Richard C. Holbrooke Distinguished Award. He nominated a Buddhist writer, philosopher in Japan. I had tears in my eyes. A Nobel in Sweden nominated a peace activist in Japan for a literary prize in Dayton, Ohio. That, as much as anything, proves to me we are not alone. Thank you.
Last night at the authors' reception, we addressed the impact that our books can have, and there was some debate about whether a writer can set out to make an impact or whether we should just focus on telling our stories well. I just wanted to share a brief personal story because many people here in Dayton have asked me about the efforts to posthumously exonerate the falsely accused men in my book, Devil in the Grove. Prior attempts at this had failed over the years. But recently, a Florida state senator named Geraldine Thompson handed out copies of the book to her fellow senators, who began reading it in their book clubs. 2 Democrats co-sponsored a bill to officially apologize and exonerate the men. Then an interesting thing happened. Some young Republicans read the book, and they too were so moved by the injustice that they too wanted to get involved. They offered a challenge to their Democrats, betting their colleagues across the aisle that they could get more Republican co-sponsors to this bill than Democrats. In April, I was invited to Tallahassee with the families of the Groveland boys, and we were told there was a good chance that the bill would pass. And in the balcony, we watched in astonishment as all 117 members of the Florida legislature stood to co-sponsor the bill. And by unanimous bipartisan vote, they apologized to the families and agreed to expedite posthumous exonerations to the Florida Pardon Board. A week later, the Florida Senate did the same with a unanimous vote of their own. I remember standing next to the director of the Florida Innocence Project at a press conference, and I asked him how, in these fractured political times, this was possible. And he shook his head and he said, I can't explain it, but they know now it's the right thing to do. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to all the volunteers. I think I've really learned how hard the volunteers have worked this weekend and how much they're involved in. And I just want to thank all of them for such a great job that they've done this entire weekend. You know, if you're lucky to come to Dayton as much as I do, you'll really begin to meet some really interesting friends that you consider friends for, I think, lifetime. I'm here, and I remember Tom Lasley last year took me to a basketball game. I spent the afternoon with Tom Lasley. In New York, I've had Mark Harmon, Bob Pohl, and his wife Susie, and his daughters come visit in New York. I've gone to New Orleans with the McDonald's, Stacy, John, for some outreach for Dayton Literary Peace Prize, doing some community involvement and panels. And there's so many people from Merle, Susan, Mark Meister, Emily, who just started this year. I just want to thank you for caring so deeply about this mission. We are going to start with James Hannaham, who is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2016 runner-up for fiction for his novel Delicious Foods, an inventive feat of storytelling bravado that captures the pathos and absurdity of addiction. In this uniquely American story of freedom, perseverance, and survival, Hanaham's daring and shape-shifting prose wrestles with timeless questions of love and freedom, forgiveness and redemption, tenacity, and the will to survive. Delicious Foods was the winner of the 2016 PEN/Faulkner Award for fiction. James Hannaham is also the author of the novel God Says No, which was honored by the American Library Association. He holds an MFA from the Michener Center at the University of Texas at Austin and lives in Brooklyn, where he teaches creative writing at the Pratt Institute. James will be introducing Ya Jesse's novel Homegoing, runner-up for the 2017 Fiction Award, and he will be accepting the award for her in absentia. James Hannaham.
Thank you very much for that introduction. But this is, it's all about Ya Jesse. Though you can't exactly categorize it as speculative fiction, Ya Jesse's ambitious and deeply generous novel, Homegoing, tells an impossible story, a tale that truly cannot be told any other way, a story that details the lives of 14 members of a family of West African heritage over hundreds of years, from 1764 until the present day. Few people have evidence of our ancestors that goes further back than our great-grandparents. Black Americans have a particularly troublesome time tracing our heritage further than the arrival of our ancestors in the United States, especially if they were slaves. The paper trail may cease at any number of moments: the Middle Passage, enslavement, sharecropping, if a paper trail ever comes into existence in the first place. Records remain scarce, and certain types of record keeping may never have occurred, since the lives to which these documents may have referred received neither honor nor respect from a society largely built through their labor. Homegoing tells us the stories of the descendants of two half-sisters, Effia and Essie, daughters of 18th century West Africa, who, though never knowing one another, become separated by local customs, the slave trade, the Middle Passage, and traditional prejudices, and ultimately time itself. One of the half-sisters becomes a slave, and the other remains behind, her legacy roiling with guilt from having aided and abetted the Europeans who began trading African people, taking advantage of the region's tribalism, by procuring their supposed enemies and profiting from their sale. Jesse implies that this, perhaps the earliest form of what we might call selling out, represents a kind of original sin for people of African descent, the evil from which many of the other evils of the slave trade seem to have erupted. Each chapter of the novel concerns a different family member who is descended from either Effia or Essie during a further moment in time, moving chronologically until this century. The book's structure in particular calls to mind a wide variety of innovative modern works, the multiple voices of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, the temporal core samples of Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, and the historical reach of David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas. Jessie's deep investment and wisdom concerning Africa and America, and the combination of the two, let's call it, raises her work into conversation with Black authors as diverse as Wole Soyinka, Toni Morrison, and Chinua Achebe. By turning these strategies on this incredible tale, she performs a necessary type of healing magic, one could say, helping us to imagine vividly the interconnected nature of humanity, which we often take for granted, and yet must remain alive to at our peril. She personalizes key events in the modern history of Black people in both Africa and America, and allows us to feel the longing and mystery that causes these events to haunt us to this very day. The book demands that we wonder, to whom am I related? To who are my relatives, and what are their stories? Can I ever know the difference between a stranger and a distant relative? These questions have always shaped Black people's lives. It's why we refer to each other as brothers and sisters. Our country deliberately cut us off from each of our specific African heritages, our languages and cultures, and instead of crumbling, we instead created a new family in this hemisphere, recombining to form, as we do in America, a tribe composed of all tribes. And while Black and mixed Americans are used to thinking of anyone with African blood or even African appearance as potential families, many of us are beginning to grapple with the various meanings of our European DNA. None of us, regardless of our skin color, can really point to another person and know for sure that he or she is not a distant relative. This is what Homegoing continuously makes clear to the reader as we savor the adventures of its 14 heroes and endure with them the hardships which stem from their estrangement. That an invisible network of blood relations surrounds us. If we all remained aware of what this astonishing novel brings to light throughout our daily lives, how could the world turn away from peaceful relations on both the level of personal politics as well as global issues? Indeed, Jessie's book insists, the failure to respect the humanity of our brothers and sisters puts a long-lasting curse on our legacy, all of our legacies, sowing chaos and pain in our personal lives and fomenting brutality and exploitation in the world. We can only change things, this book teaches us, if we learn to cherish our collective kinship. I am extremely proud to accept this award on behalf of Ya Jessie, the sister I have never met. Thank you very much.
I almost called him James Bond. God. Viet Thanh Nguyen is the winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in 2016 award in fiction for The Sympathizer, a profound, startling, and beautifully crafted debut novel, a New York Times bestseller. It also won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Viet has also been named one of 2017's MacArthur Foundation Fellows, awarded to individuals who have shown extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits and a marked capacity for self-direction. Viet was born in Vietnam and raised in America. He is the author of 2 nonfiction titles, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. He teaches English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California and currently resides in Los Angeles. His most recent book is a short story collection, The Refugees. Viet will introduce Patricia Engel, the 2017 fiction winner for The Veins of the Ocean. Viet?
It's a pleasure to be back here in Dayton, especially on this occasion. And the first time I encountered Patricia Engel was at a writing workshop in 2008. She shared a short story that instantly struck me for its vividness and intimacy. I knew immediately that Engel was a talent, a writer with something urgent to say about being Colombian, being an immigrant, being an American, being a woman, being human. It didn't take long for other people to recognize the importance of Engel's voice. The short story became part of a luminous collection, Vida, published 2 years later, told from the viewpoint of Sabina, a Colombian immigrant. When I read The Veins of the Ocean, I was again struck by how immediately Engel pulls us into her world. There's that hypnotic voice, but also a bold and confident story that tells us in the first 2 paragraphs of a father who throws his infant son off a bridge. The son survives, rescued by a fisherman. The father, taken to prison, kills himself on the next page. But the real hook of the novel comes on page 3. A lot happens in the first 3 pages, let me tell you. I'm not giving anything away. Page 3, when the baby boy's younger sister, Reina, the one telling us this story, says, when our mother told the story of our father trying to kill his son like we were people out of the Bible, part of me wished that our papi had thrown me off that bridge instead. Engel indeed gives us a biblical story of the sins of the father visited on the son. For Carlito, that infant survivor, will in turn throw his own daughter off that bridge on the very next page. Except, in Carlito's case, his daughter will not survive. Both Carlito and his father are driven by very biblical and human emotions of jealousy, of rage over the supposed adultery of the mothers of their children. But Engel's novel is much more about Reina. Like a biblical villain, or a Shakespearean one, Reina has whispered in Carlito's ear the suggestion of his lover's infidelity. It is a thoughtless move born from her own jealousy, her fear of losing a beloved brother, and its consequences will be devastating. From these sins of the family grows a powerful novel of many branches, rooted in the lives of a working-class Colombian family in Miami that still dreams of Colombia. The compelling biblical story of sin and forgiveness, of crime and punishment, involves both Reina and her brother. Carlito is condemned to solitary confinement and death, and Engel gives us an understated but also unforgettable portrait of prison life, where solitary confinement is torture, and where all of us, as a society, are implicated in a carceral system that has given up on the possibility of redemption and transformation. That crucial possibility is what Reina seeks for herself, her journey taking her to a small job working at a dolphinarium, where she realizes that dolphins are prisoners too, kept for our entertainment in a confinement that is torture as well. What Engel makes us confront about prisons and dolphinariums is that what they do to their inmates is an open secret. We all know. We just ignore their fates or enjoy them or both. The desire for freedom that is suppressed in these places is matched by the desire of people to escape other unjust situations, notably the man whom Reina learns to love, Nesto. Nesto was so confined by life in Cuba that he escaped and left behind a family that he yearns for desperately. For Nesto, Cuba is a prison. And periodically, throughout the novel, boats of Cuban refugees appear near the shores of Florida, where they become a spectacle for the beachgoers and a test. Help the migrants ashore or call the Coast Guard to prevent them from coming ashore. In Engel's expansive novel, which travels from Florida to Cuba and Colombia and back, life is full of such small tests, small but fundamental tests of our humanity. measured against our excuses and our justifications for the minor inhumanities that we live with every day. Marked by sin and crime, Reina Castillo is on a quest to understand her complicity in the injustices that she encounters, to take action to ameliorate these injustices, and to find forgiveness. Her life may seem unimportant to anyone but her and her family, but in Patricia Engel's beautiful and lyrical novel, Reina's quest to realize her humanity is epic. So, the novel suggests, is each of our own quests. Please join me in welcoming this year's winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction, Patricia Engel.
Good evening. Thank you, Viet, for that incredibly generous introduction. As you mentioned, we met almost 10 years ago at a writers' conference, and in our workshop it was challenging, and Viet and I had never met before, and he was so kind. And obviously everybody knows how brilliant he is, and his genius just comes out in every sentence that he speaks, but he was so kind to me. And I've told him this before, but I don't know if he really gets it, just how much a few remarks that he made about that story that I wrote, that he read, basically kept me going until I completed the book. I received a lot of harsh criticism in that workshop, and Viet wrote me a note that said, "Ignore them all." So, thank you again, Viet. It's an honor to share the stage with you tonight, to be here with you and with so many other extraordinary writers whose work I find so important and so inspiring. And congratulations to all of you on all your awards and everything that you do. I want to thank Sharon, Rob, Mark, Meester, and all the members of the board, the judges who selected The Veins of the Ocean, the first readers, the volunteers and the staffs of the events of this wonderful weekend, Eric and Karen Spina, the University of Dayton for being such gracious hosts, the City of Dayton for your commitment to upholding these values of peace and justice, and to all your readers, many of whom I've gotten to know over the course of the weekend, you lovers of books who've come to join in these festivities with us. Thank you all for just being here with us. I'm humbled and touched to join the tribe of Dayton Literary Peace Prize winners. As Gilbert mentioned, it's a real community, and I really feel it, even though I just got here. The mission of this tremendous honor is one that speaks to the very reason why I write. It's a reminder that even as fiction writers, we are servants to human truth. I consider the existence of this prize a revolutionary act. It's the declaration of literature as a weapon of peace, that books are more than a refuge or a pastime. They are arms because they allow us to see other worlds, live other lives. They are bombs of transformation. And of course, all this potential power is why literature is so often feared by oppressors. Through books, we see ourselves refracted, our own humanity and inhumanity on display. Books show us that all of life is a transformative act, and transformation is the enemy of injustice, which begs for stagnation and fears and resists evolution. Without transformation and evolution, we can never arrive at justice or peace. The Veins of the Ocean is a book about the prisons we all live in. It's about personal and institutionalized tyrannies, geographic and sentimental exiles, the legacy of trauma, captivity, loneliness, and dislocation. It's a book that asks, Where does one find hope when there is no hope to speak of? And how do we forgive when forgiveness is not deserved or even asked for? Tonight, I'd like to consider the question of peace. Or more importantly, when it feels so far from our grasp, how do we get there? I don't have any easy answers, but I can share with you a few things I learned along the way while researching and writing The Veins of the Ocean, a journey of several years that sent me on dozens of trips to Cuba, where portions of the novel are set, deep into the Florida Keys, and to the Caribbean coast of my parents' homeland of Colombia. First, the opposite of peace is not only war, though war is certainly a consequence of its absence. My parents come from a nation that had not known peace for more than half a century until just last year. And even now, with peace being written into law, we see how delicate it is, perpetually at risk, with countless lives lost as a truly lasting peace hangs in the balance. It's too soon to tell what will become of this fresh peace, if it will endure, and how or if justice will even play a part. This is to tell you that I was born from a nation with a legacy of unrest, and as a citizen of the United States, I make my life in a nation that believes itself to be a guardian of peace, even as we have started and contributed to so many wars around the world. What's worse than reckoning with all the blood on our hands is accepting the blood we can't see. I believe peace begins with the individual. We often think of peace as the antidote to war, but what about our small, silent violences, the automatic neutrality, coldness, and indifference with which we walk through life? We are all quietly and even gently perpetuating injustice on one another, those we know as friends, or as we pass judgment on strangers on the street, or perhaps the person standing beside us, and even on our own family members, or those whom we profess to love most in this world. We do this not only with cruel words, but every time we consciously or even unconsciously withhold kindness or compassion, empathy or mercy. Every time we hold onto a grudge, every time we choose not to forgive, every time we see or learn of someone who needs help and tell ourselves, "Not my problem," and look away. The pursuit of peace demands action in everything we do. It's how we treat the most vulnerable among us when nobody is looking or around to praise us for it. It's how we treat the worst among us, including our most violent criminals. Peace is not an oasis. It's there, right next to us, waiting to be called upon. Yet we choose against peace every day in our small gestures of what we may consider to be benign negligence. My great-grandfather died in the Terezin concentration camp in Poland. He was not shot or gassed by Nazis like so many others. He starved to death, very slowly. He was killed by an extended act of negligence. But I have asked myself many times, who is more guilty or responsible for this negligence? His Nazi captors, or the world that stood by, watching, yet doing nothing? To pursue peace doesn't always come with recognition, a pat on the back, or even a sense of satisfaction. It is most often thankless, and it usually involves appearing to be a coward, not a hero. History teaches us that the first tactic of a tyrant in turning the masses against a minority is to dehumanize them, eroding the bridge of empathy in order to create a common enemy and destroy them, either with the swiftness of a genocide or perhaps little by little, day by day, year by year, generation after generation. We don't realize how easily we fall into compliance, accepting the reduction of a people or peoples, gullibly embracing fabricated narratives that are thrust upon us to create divisions and manipulate us into believing differences devalue people rather than make them worthy of appreciation. When we do this, we're actually doing our part to withhold justice and deprive others of peace. We can't allow ourselves to be used in this way, but we must first acknowledge how we, including the best among us, are complicit. Indifference begets injustice until all we are left with is war. If not on the battlefield, then amongst neighbors, families, and within our own souls. Peace is only a dream if we refuse to live in its light. I share this prize with those who were part of the writing of The Veins of the Ocean from conception to publication, especially those who took me into their homes and shared their worlds with me. They touched my heart, they changed my life, and they changed me. I thank you all again for being here tonight, for your kind words, for listening, and for reading. And my fellow writers, again, it's an honor to be in your company. Thank you, Sharon, again, for having the courage to remind us with the founding of this prize of what we are truly called to as citizens of this earth, to uphold peace and pursue justice relentlessly and to look after one another. If we fail at this in our own lives, how can we expect more from our leaders? And finally, I dedicate this award to my parents, who, with all their great sacrifices, raised me with the belief that art, like migration, is not only a brave act of creation, but a life-saving force of resistance and rebellion. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Patricia. Congratulations again. You must be so proud for your parents to be here and to witness this. It's really beautiful. Now we move on to the nonfiction portion of this evening's festivities. Sharon Davis Grotto came to the University of Dayton as a professor and chair of the Department of Music in 2008 and served in this position for 9 years. She has taught in the music education and music therapy degree programs and founded and continues to direct the World Music Choir. Dr. Grotto is a graduate of the Oberlin College Conservatory of Music, American University, and the State University of New York at Potsdam and Catholic University. She received Oberlin's Conservatory of Music's Education Alumni Award in 2008 and the College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Service Award in 2014. The focus of her work as Grawl Chair is on diversity concerns and integrating the arts and global languages throughout students' experiences on campus and beyond. Sharon will introduce the 2017 runner-up award for nonfiction, Ben Rawlins's The City of Thorns, and she will accept Ben's award in absentia. Okay.
Just above the equator in eastern Kenya, near the Somali border, sits the Dadaab refugee camp. The name Dadaab means rocky, hard place, and it is the setting for Ben Rawlins's City of Thorns, which tells the story of the interwoven lives of 9 of the camp's residents. It is my great honor to accept the runner-up nonfiction award on Mr. Rawlins's behalf, as unfortunately he could not join us here tonight. At the time of his 7 long visits to Dadaab over 4 years, Rawlins conducted research for the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. He successfully navigated through a complicated screening process to enter Dadaab and interview more than 100 refugees before selecting the stories for this book. In each one, he relates in vivid detail the sordid and grim circumstances that caused the people to leave Somalia, their difficult journeys across the border, and their transition to begin new lives as refugees. He describes the limbo in which they found themselves, in the middle of an impossible triangle comprised of the corrupt Kenyan government, overextended international aid agencies, and the militant Islamic extremist group Al-Shabaab. The refugees were mentally and physically trapped, doing whatever necessary simply to exist as they waited for life to end. Their only dreams were of resettlement through a selection process that was continually stalled. Founded in 1991 by the United Nations Refugee Agency and the Kenyan government for 90,000 refugees fleeing Somalia's civil war, Dadaab has grown into the largest refugee camp in the world, one unknown to most people. Today, its population of over 500,000 includes 3 generations of families still living in temporary structures on 30 square miles of land with open sewage, no plumbing, and limited water, food, and other resources. Rawlins's story relates significant events in Dadaab history. In 2011, the famine in southern Somalia that forced more refugees to flee to Dadaab was declared an emergency by the United Nations. By October of the same year, Kenya had declared war on al-Shabaab in Somalia, leading to terrorist bombings both near and in Dadaab. At the United States Security Council's London Conference on Dadaab in February 2012, Somalia's leaders were directed to use the results of the conference to develop a comprehensive strategy for peace, security, and development, and to act with urgency and purpose. As recently as February 2017, the Kenyan High Court blocked a Kenyan government plan to close Dadaab because the people still had nowhere to go. I would like to share one bright moment from City of Thorns. Tawani came to Dadaab with his family in 1991 at age 7 after his brothers were killed in the Somali Civil War. He grew up to become a businessman and an important youth leader in the group. When it was time for him to hand over his position, Tawani spoke at a special ceremony describing his many accomplishments and attempting to motivate the group and its new leader. To quote from the book, "When the ceremony was over, the music began, with live instruments and singing, both seldom heard or seen in Dadaab. This was because traditional cultural festivals were no more, and religious ceremonies, including weddings that included music, had become tuneless. The boys who had the rare opportunity to watch the musicians from the windows were delirious and reeling in circles, and the sound of a talented female singer seemed to, quote, to freeze the air and calm the bird." What was Ben Rawlins's purpose in writing City of Thorns? He has said that he wanted to make readers aware of Dadaab's existence to create empathy for its people. He wanted to explain how mismanaged and improperly funded refugee camps around the world, like Dadaab, can only lead to further destabilization and radicalization of their populations. Rawlins believes that the only solution to the world refugee crisis is to close all camps worldwide and to open borders in every country for refugee resettlement. On the Dayton Literary Peace Prize website, Rawlins is quoted as saying that receiving a prize for spreading peace is the highest honor a book can receive. One can only hope that his disturbing depiction of refugee life in Dadaab reaches those who might be able to make a difference. Perhaps it is time for the current United Nations Security Council and its staff to read City of Thorns. My thanks to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize judges for recognizing Ben Rawlins's excellent work as the author of this provocative book. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. That was an excellent introduction. Susan Southard was here last year. I had the pleasure of introducing her book. Nagasaki, and it's such a pleasure to welcome her back. Susan holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and was nonfiction fellow at the Norman Mailer Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War, is the recipient of the 2016 Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Lucas Book Prize, sponsored by the Columbia School of Journalism and Harvard University's Nieman Foundation for Journalism, and was named the Best Book of the Year by The Washington Post, The Economist, the American Library Association, and Kirkus Reviews. Southard speaks across the United States about the humanitarian impact of nuclear war, and was invited last year to speak before the United Nations on behalf of ICON, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the Geneva-based organization that recently won the Nobel Peace Prize. She has taught nonfiction seminars at Arizona State University, Piper's Writers Studio, and the University of Georgia, and directed creative writing programs for incarcerated youth and at a federal prison for women outside of Phoenix. Southard is the founder and artistic director of the Phoenix-based Essential Theater, now in its 28th season. Susan will be introducing David Wood, the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction winner for What Have We Done? Susan?
Everybody else is taller. Good evening, everyone. David, if you would give me just one moment before I step into the great honor of honoring you. I'm sure that many of you have heard about the terrible news in San Antonio of the shooting in a church. I don't know much about it yet because I've only heard from others tonight. But since we are here celebrating and honoring peace, I thought maybe it would be good for us, although it's not adequate at all, if we just take 5 seconds and collectively hold the people who have died and their families and the city and our nation in our thoughts. So now to what I had originally written. I just can't tell you how absolutely wonderful it is to be back in Dayton. This amazing, thoughtful literary community committed to the complex issues of human conflict and peace. And it is my extraordinary honor to introduce to you war journalist David Wood and his powerful and heartbreaking book, What Have We Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest Wars. In this book, David illuminates a truth that until now has remained hidden, that beyond PTSD, which many soldiers suffer from, there is also moral injury, the psychological and spiritual wounds from committing, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that violate a soldier's deeply held moral beliefs. Weaving history, ethics, personal stories, and commentary, and with deep respect for the strength, courage, and commitment of our military, What Have We Done reveals the excruciating moral predicaments that our soldiers experience in our current, seemingly endless wars. He tells the story, for example, of the intense moral crisis one soldier faced. In the middle of a firefight, he sees a child with a gun. Does that child intend to shoot, or is it a terrible coincidence of timing and the child is innocent? It's an impossible situation with no right answers. If the soldier doesn't shoot the child, his troops are at risk, and protecting his men is his first responsibility. But if he kills the child, he has killed a child. In a split second, he makes his choice, and an inevitable and profound moral injury follows and stays with him for many years. Other soldiers are haunted by the deaths of innocent civilians caught in crossfire or mistakenly targeted as the enemy. For many, the act of killing at all is a moral dilemma inherent in military service. Our soldiers are trained to serve with courage, respect, and integrity, and they are trained to kill, to transgress a fundamental human and religious ethic that later leads to haunting confusion about what's right and what's wrong. The moral injuries of war, these should be obvious to us, and the devastating effects on veterans, including undermining self-doubt, the inability to trust long-held values and ethics, unrelenting shame and guilt, and self-imposed isolation from friends and loved ones. We should know this already, but we don't. Our wars are fought in other parts of the world while we go about our daily lives, often barely acknowledging what has happened so far away, without understanding the consequences, not only to the people of the nations we are fighting, but to our own soldiers, day after day, both while they are deployed and after they return home. What have we done? And what can we do now that we know? There are no easy answers, no miracle cures. David offers ways past cultures have helped soldiers bridge the moral contradictions of military and civilian life, and he provides us with new ways to talk with and listen to our veterans. Most importantly, however, David provides an understanding of this critical missing piece of our perception of war and helps close the distance between us and those who are fighting in our name. His book allows us, at last, to rightly see our soldiers' moral injuries as our own. After all, this is our nation, our military. We are accountable for when and on what grounds we go to war, and we are responsible for the moral protection of our soldiers. So it is with immense appreciation and heartfelt congratulations, please join me in welcoming to the stage this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize winner in nonfiction, David Wood.
Good evening, friends, and I say that with the deepest amount of appreciation for this gathering. Sharon, thank you for bringing us all together. I am absolutely thrilled to be here in this incredible gathering, right? I want to introduce you to Elizabeth Smedley, who, when she was about 4.5, her father died suddenly and without warning, and Elizabeth stopped speaking. Her world was shattered. And her mother, now a widow, with 3 girls under the age of 7, and no job, no income, no home, farmed Elizabeth out to live with relatives while she got things together. And so Elizabeth went to live with relatives. She didn't speak. She instead immersed herself in books, books of all kinds. I think poetry was her special love, and she lived through the stories that she found in the books that she got. Well, she did eventually regain her desire to speak, and she went on to graduate from Swarthmore College and then went to Columbia, where she got a degree in library science, and she became the children's librarian in a small town in New York where she met my father. Yes, she was my mother. And so when I was growing up, Mom would walk around the house with a children's book, saying the story to herself, memorizing the story, so that on Saturday morning, when it came time for children's story hour, she could sit in a chair, hold the book out so that the children seated on a carpet in front of her could see the pictures, and she would tell the story. And she would tell 4 or 5 storybooks that way every Saturday morning. So I grew up with the understanding that you could be a storyteller. That was a thing. You know, like every kid, I wanted to be a pilot or a race car driver or a mountain climber or something exciting like that. But I knew I could also be a storyteller. I never thought of it that way, but looking back on it, I see that I did grow up with that idea. And indeed, I did become a storyteller. I went on to become a journalist and, in short order, a war correspondent. So I did become a storyteller. My mother, Elizabeth Smedley Wood, was also the most gentle person I have ever known. I never heard her raise her voice, true. I never heard her use any strong language, anything that even approached strong language. I think she told me once that when she and her sister were small and growing up in a Quaker household, the worst thing they could say to each other was, "the Spitfire." So that was my mother, gentle, gentle woman. Towards the end of her life, she would take her motorized wheelchair out to Route 1 outside Philadelphia and hold up a sign beside the highway that said, "Stop the war." She was a gentle, gentle person. And it was with some puzzlement that she watched her son become a war correspondent. I did grow up as a Quaker. I was a conscientious objector and a pacifist. And she could never quite figure it out, although she was proud as any mother would be. I once spent a year embedded with the Marine Battalion. I basically lived with them for a year. We went to Somalia and lots of interesting things happened. But the point is that I wrote a book when I got back because there was so much about Marine life, the life of these kids we send off to war, so many stories that told of their work, their emotions, their experiences, that I couldn't put in a family newspaper. So I wrote the book, and before it was published, I sent a copy to my mom, and I called her up after a few weeks, and I said, "Did you get the book?" And she said, "Oh, yes, Dave, I got it, yes, thank you." I said, "Well, how did you like it?" She said, "Oh, I loved it, but is he really going to use the word clusterfuck in my book?" And I was like, oh. You know, coming out of the words of a mouth of a Marine, that kind of thing is like 6 times a sentence. But to hear your Quaker mother say those words was shocking. And I said, "Oh, Mom, don't say that." She said, "What, clusterfuck?" I think she'd been waiting her whole life for permission to say something like that. But here's the interesting thing, and the point of all this is that towards the end of her life, she was failing physically, although not mentally, and she decided she was going to die. And I was headed off back to Afghanistan, where I would be for a couple of months, and so it was pretty clear she was going to die while I was in Afghanistan. And so I went to spend a day with her, as each of her kids did. And before I left, I asked my wife, Beth Frere-King, who's here tonight, I said, "I don't know what do you say to your mother? I'm going to spend a day, the last day ever with my mother. What do I say to her?" And Beth said, "Well, you could tell her that you learned to be a storyteller from her." I was like, that's right, I did. So I went and spent the day with her, and I told her how much I appreciated learning from her that you could be a storyteller. And we laughed and cried and hugged, and it was a wonderful time. And then I did go off to Afghanistan, and she did pass away while I was gone. The point I want to make here is that the telling of stories, being a storyteller, is so central to our culture and so central to the whole idea of building peace. And I've started to learn a lot recently about this hard, on-the-ground work of building peace. And a lot of it has to do with stories, listening to each other's stories, understanding each other through stories, telling each other stories. This is really critically important. So I just want to end tonight by recognizing all the great storytellers in this audience and all the rest of us who have stories and who can listen to stories. Let's go out and do it and build peace. Thank you so much.
I think we have a new word to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize vocabulary. I'm not going to say it. I'm no Quaker. Well, we're at the, I guess you could say, the main portion of the evening. We're going to honor the Richard Holbrooke Lifetime Achievement Award winner. And here to do that, Andrew Krivak, the author of 2 novels, The Signal Flame and The Sojourn, which was a National Book Award finalist and received the 2012 Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction and the inaugural Chautauqua Prize. He earned an MFA from Columbia University, and he lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, with his wife and 3 children. Many of you Daytonians have known Andrew for many years. He may be the most sincere and genuinely kind-hearted person you'll ever meet here. He came to Dayton with his 3 beautiful children, and it's such a pleasure to welcome him back. Andrew will introduce this year's winner of the Richard Holbrooke Lifetime Achievement Award, Colm Tobin. Andrew, come on up.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Sharon Rabb and the prize committee for inviting me back to Dayton to be a part of this event. It's always just such a pleasure, and it's lovely to see those of you I know and have met, and to say hello. It's nice to see you again. And to you writers here for the first time, I hope that you now know you have a new home. It is a tradition for the presenter of the Richard C. Holbrooke Award for Distinguished Achievement to say a few words about Mr. Holbrooke, the man who brought men at war to Dayton, Ohio for an agreement to end a war. And I want to honor that tradition tonight. But I must say I feel as though I'm at something of a disadvantage. I never met Mr. Holbrooke. I'm not from Ohio. I'm neither a statesman nor a member of any service, foreign or military. What I know of Richard Holbrooke comes from what I've read about the man, what I've heard others say he was like, and my own interest in those parts of the world in which he was engaged in the service of diplomacy. It was no surprise to me then to have found that he was a man who thinks in narratives. He worked toward peace in the Balkans in 1994 as a writer would work to steer his or her characters to the conclusion of a story. Yet he also knew that narratives come in arcs. As long as we have thought in stories ourselves, we know that no good narrative comes without a conflict. What the ancient Greeks called the agon, the struggle, which is at the heart of every tragedy, epic journey, love story, and coming of age. While the resolution of the struggle may be the story's ultimate purpose, the tension that plays out within the arc is no less purposeful. Writers, readers, and I would venture good diplomats will tell you the key to any narrative is that terrifying moment when we must accept the truth that we don't know how it's going to end. In my Catholic boyhood in rural Pennsylvania, I was taught to think about the kingdom of heaven as a thing already and not yet. There are moments of fullness here, yet we know there's a need to work towards something more. I can't help but think that the spirit of Richard Holbrooke hopes we will not despair this evening while we are gathered to recognize achievements of peace. Many struggle still in countries around the globe, as well as in our own country, on our streets, in our workplaces, and in our homes for something yet resembling peace. And I'm glad that Susan mentioned that there is, yes, a city in Texas tonight where they are struggling with this very thing as we speak. But it should be more than a consolation that those who struggle to find peace in their lives are borne along by narratives like these we celebrate tonight, because these are the narratives in and through which we live and love and work and wait. We always have, and as long as stories are told, we always will. The first book I ever read by Colm Tóibín was The Sign of the Cross, his travelogue through Catholic Europe. It was 1996, and I was a Jesuit scholastic living and studying in Bratislava. My mother, Irene, whom I feel as though many of you know already, sent me the book just out in paperback. His chapter on the Velvet Revolution hit home about Slovakia, she wrote. So much faith after so much struggle. What are you seeing? Irene lived well the already and the not yet of her faith, hence her attraction to the Irish writer who begins the sign of the cross in his native Enniscorthy and who returns there in the shadow of Vinegar Hill after having explored not just the faith of others, but the struggle of his own, a struggle for which Irene had great respect. For my part, it was the way in which this Irish native son could write that kept the book in my backpack. In Bratislava, I might have walked past any one of the characters on the sign of the cross, but the question it raised in me was how I might find in my own struggle a narrative voice. When I returned home, I got my hands on what novels I could, which were then The South and The Heather Blazing. And so began my admiration for Colm Tóibín, which would span the next 21 years. To read Colm Tóibín is to understand the intimacy of struggle, his sense of home and the precision with which he depicts the quotidian, the daily actions of characters, the habitation not just of mind, but of the very limbs of those characters, is a quality of a writer at the height of his creative power. Do not, however, mistake this quality for passivity or quiet. Ordinary comes from the word ordinal, an ordered counting down of movement toward an end that is not an end. And it is there, on the stage of family, town, and nation, as well as in the deepest recesses of the heart, where lives struggle, where lives change. And in the house of Tóibín, there are many mansions. A writer good at revealing the struggles concealed in the depths of fictional characters has written too of his own struggle to understand what he has called the tension between the fearless imagination and the fearful self of the gay writer, men and women who live with strategies of concealment and revelation, because not just the norms, but the laws of nations and the prejudice of institutions have made this necessarily a part of their creative process. With magnanimity as well as a critical voice, Colm Tóibín reminds us that private struggles are no less purposeful because the struggle is not acceptable to some. The struggle in silence does not mute the struggle of life. In lands real and imagined, families whole and broken, characters homebound and exiled, lovers generous and forbidden, Colm Tóibín's hold is unfailingly on struggle and the tensions it illuminates. For in the ordinariness and complexity, intimacy and longing of every struggle, there we recognize our own. Listen to the woman whose son is dying of AIDS. I'd love if some of the happiness could be there in his spirit when he goes, as well as all the suffering. To the exile returned, home was some graves where my dead lay, outside the town of Enniscorthy, just off the Dublin road. To ancient memories from the house of Atreus, in time, what had happened would haunt no one and belong to no one, once they themselves had passed on into darkness and into the abiding shadows. To Mary, the mother of Jesus, if you want witnesses, then I am one, and I can tell you now, when you say that he redeemed the world, I will say it was not worth it. And to the words of a religious sister of St. John, of God, standing by the sea in Ireland in the fog. It is the others who have already found their peace. We walk among them sometimes, the ones who have left us. They are filled with something none of us knows yet. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me this evening to introduce to you the 2017 winner of the Richard C. Holbrooke Award for Distinguished Achievement in Literature, Mr. Colm Tobin.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to lower the microphone a bit too. A few years ago, there was a party like this. There was a lot of Chardonnay. It often lifts the spirit. And someone came up to me and said, "You know, I never heard of you before, but I'm going to read all your books." And I wanted to say to her, "No, please don't do that. If you just read one or two, 1.5, or just start one, or one short story or something." But all that struggle, even when you were talking about some of them, no, just one or two would be enough, because that's why I sort of looking around. I'm really grateful for this, and I feel really honored, but I'm a bit worried in case some of the judges might have read more than one or two, and that struggle that goes on in the books that I put so much into might have permanently darkened their minds, and I would worry about that. In the old days when we watched Westerns, we would sit up straight, even in Ireland, and feel excited in that moment in the movie when the figure appears behind the boulder on the hill and narrows his eyes as the wagons and horses below make their journey westward through new and unmapped territory. We know now that there will be action. The white man and woman moving slowly with their language and their need to make fences, they will have reason and technology on their side. The Native American will have an aboriginal relationship with the landscape and will have a language that the microphone can barely pick up. And once the territory has been mapped by the white man, the Native American language will live on, mainly in the names of some places. Its grammar will not grace the marketplace. Since it has no reason to spread, then it will slowly fade. And so it begins, the colonial drama. As we watch this scene, if we are Irish or Catalan or Croatian or Serb, it feels like something whose contours and emotions we fully recognize. It is easy then to remember moments from the places where two languages have collided, or when one folded uneasily over another. It is easy to conjure up those gnarled landscapes of possession and dispossession in all their disturbed imagery. If later, in a moment around a campfire, one of the Native Americans were to sing a song about love, in the language which they all share, there will be silence. They will think at first of love, and then maybe of lost love, and then maybe they will begin to contemplate other things they have lost or might come soon to lose, which the notes of the song seem to suggest more precisely than any list they could make. Some sense of themselves, who they are, where they belong. This sense, the emotion involved, will be more pressing and powerful than maps, laws, fences, borders. For the white people on their way to victory, this idea of having a precise place in which you belong will be taken for granted now. It will not need to be felt because it is not being threatened. It will seem natural, almost God-given. For others, however, it will mutate into terms with many meanings, which will come to haunt the second half of the 19th and much of the 20th and indeed the 21st century. Terms such as nationalism, terms such as identity. Take this one, for example. It was Tallinn in Estonia in 1994, and the Russians had finally left. And I was having supper with an Estonian family who were so relieved at what had happened and so full of hope for their country. They wanted now to connect with Scandinavia, They wanted to join the European Union. They saw Russia as an old, dark place that was not progressive. They saw the Russian language as something that had been foisted on them. They didn't want to hear it again. They wanted to hear their own language, and maybe Swedish and Finnish, but more than anything, English. The fact that there was just 1.5 million of them seemed only to add to their optimism, increase their happiness at the thought that they might finally be left in peace. They felt pride in themselves and who they were and what they might become. The only difficulty, or the only difficult moment during that supper that evening in Tallinn came when my host described the large Russian population of Estonia, who had suddenly found themselves in a country whose official language they did not speak. They still believe they are in Russia, my host told me. Soon, they said, these Russians, they would have to learn Estonian or just go home, even though many of them had actually been born in Estonia. I could feel my host's idealism, their understanding of this as an imperative, something which must happen in a small, fragile country if its entire identity was not to be lost. But I was uneasy. The idea of inclusion, the understanding that diversity and impurity have rights too, and the tolerance of others who do not fully share a nation's identity was also an imperative, would take time to seep into the body politic of Estonia. This idea of a nation being created or imagined from deep roots in the past and fragile ones in the present was something that anyone Irish is acutely conscious of. The songs written by the members of a group called Young Ireland in the years around 1848 inspired a new national feeling. When boyhood's fire was in my blood, I read of ancient freemen of Greece and Rome who bravely stood 300 men and 3 men. And yet I prayed I yet might see our fetters rent in twain, for Ireland long a province be, a nation once again. And such songs would foment a national spirit which would help eventually to lead to the independence of the south of Ireland in 1922 and its becoming a republic in 1948. But in these small countries of ours, which have known that complex set of emotions about identity and loss of identity, nothing is simple. In Ireland, in the very years when a national spirit was being created, the English language was moving slowly into a dominant position. No one has ever fully explained why Ireland did not become bilingual, why the Irish language began to actually disappear. It seems history is to blame, as the Englishman says in James Joyce's Ulysses. I come from a place where identity has been entwined with and sometimes choked by religion. During the war in the former Yugoslavia, the war whose end was negotiated here in Dayton with Richard Holbrooke, after whom this prize is called, as one of the main architects of the agreement, I travelled through Croatia and Herzegovina. I saw buildings burn. The house where I stayed had sheds in the backyard filled with arms that would be used eventually to attack the Muslim population of Mostar. In Zagreb and in Medjugorje, I attended Mass with the translator, since I wanted to hear the sermons. What was surprising was that even though this was during the war, there were never prayers for peace, as there always were in Ireland, in both Catholic and Protestant churches during our troubles. Eventually, when I asked a priest in Herzegovina about this, he shrugged. And when I persisted, asking him if he had reached out to the churches on the other side in the war, he became almost angry, referring to the Orthodox faith as a dime store religion. I realized then that it was going to take a great deal of time for this war to end and for the wounds that it opened to heal. Or take the following moment. In 1986, as the troubles in Northern Ireland were really at their height, I went to the home of Alan Black in Bessbrook in County Armagh in Northern Ireland. He was a Northern Irish Protestant and I was a Southern Irish Catholic. A decade earlier, when he was coming home from work with 11 of his workmates, the van was stopped by what they had thought at first was the British Army. 10 of them were Protestants like him, but one was a Catholic who was told to identify himself and step aside. And then, in one of the worst sectarian attacks in the history of Northern Ireland, the 11 Protestants were shot. 10 of them died. Alan Black survived. We sat in his front room and watched a documentary that had been made about these killings. And then we started to talk about politics. about the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which had been signed the year before by the British and Irish governments, which gave the Irish government a say in the running of Northern Ireland. Like most Protestants in Northern Ireland, however, Allen was against the agreement. He did not believe that the Dublin government had any right to be involved in the governance of Northern Ireland. I was interested in what he had to say. Up to then, I had believed that such opposition was just irrational, something which arose from pure bigotry as much as anything else. And up to then, I have to admit, I had only once or twice sat in the home of a Northern Protestant on such easy and familiar terms. The partition of Ireland had kept us two men apart. I listened carefully as Alan Black turned to me and said that as a Protestant, he was against all forms of arbitrary authority, not only in religious but in civil affairs. That was the basis of his citizenship. And that was, he implied, why people like him in Northern Ireland did not want a united Ireland. They saw the Republic of Ireland as a Catholic state, and they saw Catholicism as a form of arbitrary authority. And now the Anglo-Irish Agreement was allowing a government for which he could not vote, which was not accountable to him, have some power in his country. He thought this was wrong. What was strange was that I had never heard this argument before. But I was not sure about it. The Anglo-Irish Agreement had for the first time recognised the allegiances of Northern Irish Catholics as being valid, as later agreements in Northern Ireland would accept the possibility of dual allegiances. In places where there are competing questions and arguments over nations, identities, allegiances, and borders, nothing is ever simple. It is often easier to be puzzled than sure, to say both as much as and or. As one of the characters says in Brian Friel's play translations, confusion is not an ignoble condition. And then there's the question of Catalonia in the news now. On the 27th of April, 1988, I went to the holy mountain of Montserrat, north of Barcelona, for the feast day of the Virgin. Later, when the ceremonies were over, I decided to walk back down the mountain. Soon I was offered a lift by an elderly couple. They were both from Madrid and spoke in Spanish. They had come especially for the feast of the Virgin, they said, but they did not want to stay any longer. They did not like what they saw. The mountain was beautiful and they had enjoyed the journey. The problem was the language. They couldn't understand a word of the Mass, not a word of the sermon. They were in Catalan, not in Spanish. And they were in their own country, they both explained. To make matters worse, the wife had tried to buy some holy pictures with prayers printed on them, but they had them only in Catalan, and she'd left without buying anything. Was everything like that now, they asked me. It was, I said. There was a television station in Catalan, many radio stations, 2 newspapers, signs in shops, lessons in schools, lectures in the university, all in Catalan. In Barcelona, I said that street names were in Catalan only. The husband said that he was first in Barcelona in 1939, and it was a great city. He had never imagined this could happen, he said, in his own country. Why do they want to have everything in Catalan, they asked. The wife, didn't understand why they couldn't just use Catalan among themselves. But surely for big occasions, like the feast day of Montserrat, they could just use Spanish, which was a language everyone understood. And so the argument goes on to this day. And often the argument we have in these complex nations of ours about identity deal with silence, deal with things which mustn't be said, which can't be said. So 2 years ago, when we had a referendum on the subject of gay marriage in Ireland, something which mattered a lot to me personally, we were given great instructions from on high within the gay movement, which was, could you guys just be silent for 3 weeks during this campaign? We don't want to hear from gay people. Could gay people just go really quiet and just look hurt? But if you're going to, a lot of campaigning in Irish elections is door to door. You just knock on someone's door and you say, "Would you vote for my party?" But don't do it. Go with your mother. Go with your sister. Go with your granny. If you get your granny, I'd get your granny to go with you and say, "This is my grandson, and he's gay, and we really love him. And we were at his sister's wedding last year, and we'd love to go to his wedding next year. And I know you don't agree with gay stuff, but if you could just lend us your vote, then that would be okay. Almost suggesting we might give it back next year. And so the campaign became about inclusion. Families began to talk about how much they loved all of their children, including their gay daughter, including their gay son, including their gay uncle. And the word love became the word inclusion, the word family, things that mattered in Ireland to everybody in any case. And then the former president of Ireland, Mary McAleese, intervened towards the end of the campaign. She'd been president for 14 years, a devout Catholic. I mean, so she's holier than the Pope, Mary, sometimes, and or holier than Pope Benedict, anyway. She said, well, you know, I have twins, and Justin is gay, but the other one isn't. So what am I to tell them? That I can go to one of their weddings and not the other? And if they ask me why, what will I say to them? Can anyone help me with this? And so in using implication, in appealing to people's better natures, in not getting involved in arguments or heated discussion, in attempting to enter people's spirit, the referendum was won 65 to 35, and it was a great day for the country. This business of what we want in the world, however, remains complex and is not always rational, even if it can be made to seem so at times. We live in a country, the Republic of Ireland, where 35% voted no. They are our neighbours, our friends, sometimes our family, and they are part of our country, and we have to include them also. Identity comes from something deep and strange, and the idea of language, in all its complexity, lives at the mysterious core of what it is to be alive in the world. As Caliban in Shakespeare had occasion to say to Prospero in his famous cry in The Tempest, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language." This relationship between Caliban and Prospero has many forms throughout history, most of them protean and unstable, filled with ironies and strange twists. The idea, for example, of the small country or the nation remaining peaceful under some pressures and becoming assertive under others was something that Richard Holbrooke was deeply alert to. The idea then, as I said, that nothing is simple within this world, filled with constitutional compromises, remaining grievances, conflicting loyalties, competing identities, racial tension, irrational hatred, uneasy allegiances, uncertain borders that are built too well, and unpredictable outcomes can be used to explain what is happening now in England, Scotland, Catalonia, Kurdistan, to name just 4 places, and perhaps also here in the United States. But it might also be true to say that this idea of identity under pressure, in one form or another, has been present in history since time began. In its own way, it represents a secret history of the world we have inherited. It is unlikely to go away. In this context, people with the vision of Richard Holbrooke will always be needed, and we should honour their achievement and their memory. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I think we're all so much smarter this evening for being exposed to these beautiful minds, these brilliant writers. It reminds me of a story. Early in my literary career, I used to do some editorial work, ghost writing, editorial writing for anthologies. And one of the brilliant people I was able to work with was Stephen Hawking. And it was the subject of one of the greatest emails I've ever received in my life. The subject said, "Gilbert, Professor Hawking has a question." And I remember thinking, damn it, Hawking, how many times are we going to go over these black holes? I hope you all enjoyed the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize as much as I did. On behalf of all the writers, I really want to thank this Dayton community for your continued support, your overwhelming hospitality over this weekend, and your genuine commitment toward spreading peace through the written word. So thank you very much. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and here to close this wonderful evening, under the direction of Jeremy Winston, the Central State University Chorus. They will be singing "The Word Was God," arranged by Rosaphane Powell, "Let There Be Peace on Earth," arranged by Levante Hurd, Shaniqua Nixon, and Jeremy Winston. Here we go, Central State University Chorus.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. In the beginning was the same was in the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
All things were made, that have been made. Nothing was made, He has not made.
way.